Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. I'm the Magi, and today we are going to address one of the most common questions that I or probably any other content creator get when it comes to MtG Arena. And that is, what do you really need? Or to put a different spin on it, how to tackle the wide array of play options within Arena in order to have more fun and be more efficient in growing your collection. And really, it comes down to just 4 easy steps that we're going to talk about in depth today. So folks, stay tuned. This is a good one for a lot of you.
Before we get into all that, take just a second and smash the like button. Truly, it'll only take a moment to do all of those YouTube things, and it really helps the community. Speaking of community, if you haven't been seeing our community updates, take a moment, tap the bell icon, and update your notification settings. There's a lot of great information, and your voice can help shape the future of the channel. Now, what were we talking about? Oh yeah, right.
All right, so let's start off this conversation about what you need with what you already have. That mostly being your new player experience decks that came to you from doing the color challenges. And, you know, there's a lot of decks here, 15 in total. They vary in degrees of fun and effectiveness, but the one you really need to keep an eye on, and the one that, in my opinion, you're going to want to reach for first, is the red-green on the Hunt deck. This deck is, in my opinion, the best one out of the box and really doesn't need a whole lot of upgrades. If you look over on my EtherHub account, you'll find a day one optimized version of this deck that basically just uses cards from your other new player experience collection to make this deck a little bit more efficient. Basically dropping some of these higher mana beaters and things like that, adjusting the mana base ever so slightly, things like that, and talk about some ways that you might want to improve the deck overall, and some different pathways for doing that. For instance, the Naturalist and Paxson Pup are both very, very good. And you're going to want more copies of that as soon as you can do a little bit drafting on those Innistrad sets and pick those up. In addition, if you want to play this deck in Alchemy, and I'm not saying you necessarily should, but if you want to, investing in some copies of Tenacious Pup really does improve this deck. And there's lots of different ways to make room for those slots, and probably the easiest way to do it is to cut the Snarling Wolf for it if you just want to leave the deck card for card the way it already is. This makes a perfect day one grinder deck to try and get those daily challenges, get your wins in, things like that. Really, again, from day one with very little need or incentive to change the deck. Now, by properly managing your daily challenges and spinning away things like low value or color challenges that don't really align with your deck choices, you will be surprised at just how efficiently you're able to chew through these at a good rate. Never having 3 at the end of the day is very, very achievable and not at all difficult. But eventually you're going to get a high value challenge that does not align with your primary grinder, and at that point you are going to need a second deck. And you can very easily just come back in here to your starters and pick something that is going to line up. And if this happens to happen in your first week or so, this is probably your best choice. Beyond that, there are a ton of good budget decks out there available for anyone to be able to pick up and play. If you look over on my Ether Hub, I generally keep 15 to 20 budget decks available out there, and it's not hard to find something that appeals to you. But what you might want to consider is adding an entire new format to your repertoire just to change things up. Not only changing up your colors, but your entire play style and the pace and feel of the game altogether. That's right, I would suggest that you consider building a Brawl deck. Because not only is this going to give you a second pair of colors, ideally, or at least allow you to pick up a third color to complete your challenges, but also has a completely different tempo and idea to the game. Brawl tends to be generally less competitive, although your experience may vary. And generally you have a more laid back, fun-based environment where people are maybe trying more janky combos and things like that. And that can be a real change of pace from the day-to-day standard grind. Brawl also has the added benefit of being fairly budget accessible, because one of the cornerstones of Brawl is it is a singleton environment, meaning you can only run one copy of any given card. So either you have it or you don't. It's never a matter of, well, I really shouldn't build this deck until I have 4 copies of whatever. One is all you need. In addition, the complementary format for Eternal is Historic Brawl. And while the 100 card deck size might seem a little bit daunting, keep in mind that about 40% of that is going to be lands anyway, so you're really only talking about 36 or so extra cards over a standard-based Brawl deck. This also gives you a venue to start using any packs that you have opened from those Eternal only sets, i.e. anything you can't use in standard. It also gives you a place to use all of those cards from your monocolor new player experience that maybe you're not looking to explore in Alchemy, as well as any Alchemy packs that you've opened can find a home in a Historic Brawl deck. And like all Eternal formats, any wild cards that you invest here are probably going to get a lifetime of play, as opposed to a lot of things that might be staples in standard but just never really relevant in the Eternal formats. Now, whether you started this process in Brawl or not, the next step for most of you is going to be delving into the Eternal formats. And there's 2 basic options here, Explorer or Historic. The principal difference is going to come down to how you feel about Alchemy as a format and the cards that it introduces, because of course Historic uses those Alchemy cards, but Explorer does not. Explorer is also the evolving gateway towards having Pioneer available on Arena. Now, as you can see here from today's meta sampling, monocolor decks are very much part of the higher tier meta. Mono red, of course, is the ubiquitous starter deck in any given format and is a very good place to start. But as you can see here, easily in the top 10, you get a monocolor of every single variety. The Selesnya deck that you see here is actually just mono white angels, and it splashes for the Coco. staple within green and is splashable in almost any sort of creature-based tribal deck. Coco, of course, being collective company. Easily one of the early wild cards, depending upon which way you want to go on that. Historic also going to look very similar. You've got your mono red going on, but as is typical with alchemy as well, you are going to see a greater deck diversity. And the nice thing about the Eternal formats is they are much slower to evolve. So not only do your wild cards never really rotate out, but once invested wisely, those cards will continue to be very playable for years to come. For instance, almost any mono red wild card that you put in, you're going to be able to play that forever and ever, although there will be times that a particular card will be more or less popular, but almost never goes from very playable to completely unplayable. One of the final steps in your arena evolution is going to be investing and adopting a competitive level deck, something that will allow you to move up the ranks. And honestly, this is not something that you need to be in a rush to do, although for a certain segment of players, competitive play is really what it's all about. And I understand for some of you, this is going to be a much higher priority than others. I can tell you as a value free-to-play player, moving up the meta is not the most efficient use of my time. I would much rather just slowly grind at lower levels of play and build up my collection. But as I said, competitive play is almost inevitable for the majority of players. Whether you do that in the standard meta that you see here in front of you, or you go into the Explorer meta that we just finished looking at, you will see several trends. Right now, monocolored decks are really not only viable, but are some of the most played options available in the meta. And there's one in particular right now that I think you need to pay a lot of attention to. And that, of course, is the mono blue control deck. Primarily, this deck is made up of highly playable and accessible commons and uncommons. In fact, you can build this deck for 4 or less rare wildcards. That, of course, being all about Hadi Jin. Ultimately, this deck wants 4 copies of this creature, but you don't necessarily have to have 4 copies to make the deck work. In fact, I did an entire video on how to build this on a budget and viable substitutions for that. A 5th potential rare that you might want is the Soaring City from Kamigawa, the legendary land that allows you to bounce a target artifact, creature, enchantment, or planeswalker to its owner's hand. If you have it, great. If you don't, it's probably worth considering investing a wild card in. But if you're not in the position to do that, you can certainly play the deck with just 22 islands. Now, as you have probably guessed, this is not the optimized version of the deck. For that, you really want to check out the list on EtherHub and maybe check out the earlier YouTube video where I go into great detail about how to build this deck and viable substitutes for a fairly recent midweek Magic event. At any rate, this is the final step towards conquering the arena formats and having as many viable options as you possibly can. But again, competitive is not necessarily the best use of your time, and it's not for everyone. So if you never get to this step, don't feel bad. You may not be missing out on much.
Wait, what's that? You didn't catch all of that? Well, Matt would probably want you to know that no matter what step you're on in this process or where your interests ultimately lie or where you might need help, I've got links down in my doobly-doo to take you to grinders, eternal decks, brawl decks, anything you might possibly need, including specifically the mono blue control list that I am recommending for folks. So check that out. And folks, before you go, make sure you've subscribed to the channel so you don't miss out on a thing. Because I know I can't change the magic economy all by myself, but I think we can.